I am your guide on a journey into the past, a journey designed to help you relax and drift into a deep and restful sleep. Tonight, we will travel back to the 14th century, to a time when Europe was on the cusp of a monumental transformation. It was a world of castles and knights, of burgeoning cities and ancient traditions. But it was also a world about to be visited by a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions, a pestilence that would forever alter the course of human history. This is the story of the Black Death, the most devastating pandemic to ever strike humanity. As you settle into a comfortable position, allow your body to relax and your mind to become still. Let my voice be a gentle anchor, guiding you through the annals of time. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to think about, except to listen and allow the story to unfold. We will explore the origins of this mysterious illness, trace its relentless march across continents, and witness the profound impact it had on the medieval world. We will delve into the science behind the plague, the social and religious upheavals it caused, and the ways in which it reshaped the very fabric of European society. This is not a story of fear, but of understanding. It is a tale of resilience, of adaptation, and of the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. As you listen, you may find your thoughts drifting, your focus softening. That is perfectly fine. The purpose of this journey is to provide a calm and steady stream of information, a gentle current to carry you into the realm of dreams. So close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let us begin our exploration of the Black Death, a chapter of history that, for all its darkness, holds valuable lessons for our own time. Let the story begin and let your journey to sleep commence. Origins and early spread, our story begins not in the bustling cities of Europe, but in the vast and remote landscapes of Central Asia. In the year 1338, a strange and deadly illness began to claim lives near Lake Issyk-Kul in what is now modern-day Kyrgyzstan. The local Christian community, nestled among the towering peaks of the Tian Shan Mountains, recorded an unusually high number of deaths, their tombstones bearing inscriptions that spoke of a mysterious pestilence. This was the first whisper of the storm that was to come, a localized outbreak that would soon spill across the known world. The agent of this devastation was a tiny rod-shaped bacterium known as Yersinia pestis. For centuries, this microbe had lived in a delicate balance with its natural hosts, wild rodents such as marmots and gerbils that roamed the vast grasslands of the Asian steppes. The bacterium was transmitted between these animals by fleas, which would ingest the pathogen when they fed on an infected host and then pass it on to the next. In this isolated ecosystem, the plague smoldered for generations, a hidden threat largely unknown to the human population. But the 14th century was a time of change. The Mongol Empire, which had once unified much of Eurasia, was beginning to fracture, leading to increased conflict and displacement. Climate change, too, played a crucial role. A period of cooling and drought in Central Asia disrupted the delicate balance of the steppe ecosystem, forcing rodent populations to seek new sources of food and water. As they moved, they came into closer contact with domesticated animals and, inevitably, with humans. The Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes that connected the East and the West, became the primary conduit for the plague's westward expansion. Caravans of merchants, their camels laden with silks, spices, and other exotic goods, unknowingly carried the seeds of the pandemic with them. Fleas, hidden in the fur of black rats that infested the caravan supplies, were the primary vectors of transmission. These rats, resilient and adaptable, thrived in the burgeoning urban centers of the medieval world, making them the perfect Trojan horse for the plague. From the steppes of Central Asia, the plague crept steadily westward, following the well-trodden paths of commerce. It reached the northern shores of the Caspian Sea, then moved into the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that controlled much of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. By 1346, the plague had arrived at the gates of Europe, an invisible and insidious enemy that was about to unleash a wave of death and destruction unlike anything the continent had ever seen. The stage was set for a tragedy of epic proportions, a story of a world on the brink of a terrifying new reality. The arrival in Europe, the year is 1347. The Genoese trading port of Kaffa, a bustling hub of commerce on the Crimean Peninsula, is under siege. The Mongol army of Khan Janibeg has surrounded the city, determined to capture this strategic outpost. But the besieging army is afflicted by a strange and deadly illness, their soldiers dying in droves. In a desperate and horrifying act of biological warfare, Khan Janibeg orders the catapults to be loaded not with stones, but with the plague-infested corpses of his own men. The bodies are hurled over the city walls, raining down upon the terrified inhabitants. This is how the Black Death made its dramatic and terrifying entrance into Europe. The Genoese, horrified and overwhelmed, abandoned Kaffa and fled by sea. But they could not outrun the plague. 12 galleys, their holds filled with refugees and their hulls infested with plague-carrying rats, set sail for Italy. In October of 1347, they arrived at the port of Messina in Sicily. The townspeople who gathered at the docks were met with a gruesome sight. Most of the sailors aboard the ships were either dead or gravely ill, their bodies covered in black boils that oozed blood and pus. The Sicilian authorities, in a desperate attempt to contain the outbreak, ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was too late. The plague had already taken root. From Messina, the Black Death spread with terrifying speed. It moved to the port of Marseille in France and the port of Tunis in North Africa. It then reached Rome and Florence, two cities at the center of an elaborate web of trade routes. By the middle of 1348, the plague had struck Paris, Bordeaux, Lyon, and London. No corner of the continent seemed safe from its relentless advance. The people of medieval Europe were utterly unprepared for the horror that was unfolding. They had no understanding of the science of contagion, no knowledge of the microscopic world of bacteria and viruses. They could only watch in terror as their friends, their families, and their neighbors succumbed to the mysterious illness. The sheer speed and ferocity of the plague were unlike anything they had ever witnessed. It seemed to be a punishment from God, a sign of the apocalypse, a force of nature that could not be stopped. The initial reactions were a mixture of fear, confusion, and desperation. People fled the cities in droves, hoping to escape the pestilence in the countryside. But the plague followed them, carried by the rats and fleas that were ubiquitous in medieval life. The social fabric began to unravel. Parents abandoned their sick children, husbands left their wives, and the sick were left to die alone. The bonds of community, once so strong, were severed by the overwhelming fear of contagion. Europe was plunging into a dark and terrifying new era, an age of death and despair that would leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of the Western world. The horrific symptoms. The experience of the Black Death was one of unimaginable horror, a descent into a nightmare of physical and psychological torment. The Italian poet Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the plague in Florence, left behind a chillingly detailed account of its symptoms. In men and women alike, he wrote, "At the beginning of the malady, certain swellings, either on the groin or under the armpits, waxed to the bigness of a common apple, others to the size of an egg, some more and some less, and these the vulgar named plague boils. These swellings, known as buboes, were the hallmark of the most common form of the plague, bubonic plague. They were caused by the Yersinia pestis bacteria invading the lymphatic system, the body's network of tissues and organs that help to rid the body of toxins and waste. The lymph nodes, overwhelmed by the infection, would swell to grotesque proportions, becoming hard, painful, and filled with pus. The skin around the buboes would often turn black, a result of subcutaneous hemorrhages, giving the disease its ominous name, the Black Death. But the buboes were only the beginning of the ordeal. As the infection progressed, a host of other agonizing symptoms would appear. A high fever would set in, accompanied by violent chills and uncontrollable shivering. The victim would be racked with terrible aches and pains in their limbs and back. Nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea would add to their misery, leaving them weak and dehydrated. In some cases, the plague would infect the lungs, leading to a more virulent form of the disease known as pneumonic plague. This form was even more deadly, as it could be transmitted directly from person to person through airborne droplets, much like the common cold. The victim would cough up blood and struggle for breath, their lungs filling with fluid until they suffocated. A third form of the plague, septicemic plague, occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly. This was the most lethal form of all, with a mortality rate of nearly 100%. The victim would experience a rapid drop in blood pressure, their organs would begin to fail, and their skin would turn a dark purplish black color as their blood vessels hemorrhaged. Death would often come within a matter of hours, a swift and merciless end to a terrifying ordeal. The people of the 14th century had no way of understanding what was happening to them. Their medical knowledge was based on the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, which held that illness was caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids. They believed that the plague was caused by miasma, or bad air, and they tried to protect themselves by burning aromatic herbs and carrying sweet-smelling flowers. But these measures were, of course, utterly ineffective. The true cause of the plague, the tiny bacterium carried by fleas and rats, remained a mystery for another 500 years. The people of medieval Europe were left to face the horror of the Black Death with nothing but their faith, their fear, and their utter helplessness in the face of an invisible and of an enemy they could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. Geographic spread and timeline. The Black Death's journey across Europe was a relentless and terrifying march, a wave of death that washed over the continent with astonishing speed. The plague did not discriminate, striking down the rich and the poor, the young and the old, the pious and the profane. Its progress can be traced year by year, a grim chronicle of a world succumbing to a devastating pandemic. 1347, the year the plague arrived. After its dramatic entrance at Kaffa and its subsequent arrival in Messina, the Black Death quickly spread to other parts of Sicily and the Italian mainland. The port cities of Genoa and Venice, major hubs of international trade, became epicenters of the outbreak, their ships carrying the pestilence to other ports around the Mediterranean. By the end of the year, the plague had a firm foothold in Europe, and the stage was set for a continent-wide catastrophe. 1348. The year of the Great Dying. The plague exploded across Europe with terrifying force. It swept through Italy, Spain, and France, leaving a trail of death and devastation in its wake. The city of Florence, a vibrant center of art and commerce, lost more than half of its population. In France, the plague reached Paris, the largest city in Europe, where it claimed the lives of thousands of people every day. The port of Marseille, a key gateway to the Mediterranean, was hit particularly hard. In England, the plague arrived in the summer at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset. It spread rapidly throughout the southwestern counties, reaching Bristol and then London by the end of the year. 1349, the plague moves north. The pestilence continued its northward march, reaching the northern counties of England, Wales, and Ireland. It then crossed the North Sea to Scandinavia, where it devastated the populations of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Germany, Austria, and the Low Countries were also hit hard, their cities and towns ravaged by the disease. The plague's progress was relentless, a seemingly unstoppable force that was redrawing the demographic map of Europe. 1350, the plague reaches the far corners of Europe. The pestilence spread to the Baltic countries, to Eastern Europe, and even to Greenland, where it contributed to the collapse of the Norse settlements. By the end of the year, almost every corner of Europe had been touched by the Black Death. The initial wave of the pandemic was beginning to subside, but the damage was done. An estimated 25 to 50 million people, between 30% and 6% of Europe's population, had perished. 1351 and beyond, the plague's enduring legacy. The Black Death was not a one-time event. It returned in waves, with major outbreaks occurring in 1361-63, 1369-71, 1374-75, 1390, and 1400. These recurring plagues, though less widespread than the initial pandemic, continued to take a heavy toll on the population, preventing a swift recovery and prolonging the period of social and economic disruption. The Black Death had become a permanent and terrifying feature of medieval life, a constant reminder of the fragility of human existence and the awesome power of the natural world. Social and religious consequences, the Black Death was more than just a demographic catastrophe. It was a profound social and psychological trauma that shook the foundations of medieval society. The sheer scale of the death and suffering was incomprehensible, and it led to a widespread breakdown of social order and a crisis of faith that would have far-reaching consequences. In the face of a seemingly unstoppable and inexplicable plague, the people of the 14th century turned to religion for answers. The prevailing belief was that the Black Death was a punishment from God, a divine retribution for the sins of mankind. This led to a surge in religious fervor, with people flocking to churches, making desperate pleas for mercy, and participating in mass processions and pilgrimages. But as the plague continued to rage and as prayers and supplications went unanswered, faith began to waver. The perceived failure of the church to protect its flock from the pestilence led to a decline in its authority and a growing sense of disillusionment among the populace. This crisis of faith gave rise to a number of extremist religious movements, the most famous of which was the Flagellants. These were groups of penitents who would travel from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges studded with iron spikes. They believed that by inflicting this punishment upon themselves, they could atone for the sins of the world and appease the wrath of God. The Flagellants were a dramatic and disturbing spectacle, their processions drawing large crowds of onlookers. But their movement was ultimately condemned by the church as heretical, and they were eventually suppressed. The search for a scapegoat also led to a horrific wave of violence against Jewish communities. Jews had long been a target of persecution in Christian Europe, and in the atmosphere of fear and paranoia created by the plague, they became an easy target for blame. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the disease. These accusations, though baseless, led to a series of brutal pogroms in which thousands of Jews were massacred. The Strasbourg massacre of 1349, in which over 2,000 Jews were burned alive, is just one example of the horrific violence that was unleashed. The social fabric of medieval Europe was torn apart by the Black Death. The traditional bonds of family and community were severed as people abandoned their sick loved ones for fear of contagion. The sheer number of deaths led to a breakdown in essential services. There were not enough people to bury the dead, and mass graves were dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of corpses. The fields lay fallow, the workshops fell silent, and the cities became ghost towns. The world, it seemed, was coming to an end. But in the midst of this despair, the seeds of a new world were being sown, a world that would be forged in the crucible of the Black Death. Economic and long-term impact. The Black Death was a cataclysmic event that left an indelible mark on the economic and social landscape of Europe. The staggering loss of life, with some estimates suggesting that as much as 60% of the population perished, created a severe labor shortage that would have profound and lasting consequences. This demographic collapse, though tragic, would ultimately pave the way for a new economic order and a period of unprecedented social change. Before the plague, Europe was a continent of serfs and lords, a feudal society in which the vast majority of the population was tied to the land and subject to the will of a small landowning elite. But the Black Death shattered this old order. With so many peasants dead, the surviving laborers found themselves in a position of newfound power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater freedom. The traditional bonds of serfdom began to weaken, and a new class of free peasants emerged. The labor shortage also had a dramatic impact on agriculture. With fewer people to work the land, many large estates were abandoned, and the focus of agriculture shifted from grain production to less labor-intensive activities, such as sheep farming. This led to a decline in the price of grain and an increase in the availability of meat and dairy products, improving the diet and the standard of living for the average person. The economic and social changes brought about by the Black Death were not without conflict. The ruling classes, seeing their power and wealth diminish, tried to resist the tide of change. They passed laws such as the Statute of Labours in England, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels. But these measures were largely unsuccessful, and they often led to popular uprisings, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The old feudal order was dying, and a new, more dynamic and more mobile society was being born. The Black Death also had a profound impact on the cultural and intellectual life of Europe. The trauma of the plague led to a new preoccupation with death and mortality, which was reflected in the art and literature of the period. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting people from all walks of life being led away by a skeletal figure of death. This new awareness of the fragility of life also contributed to a growing sense of individualism and a questioning of traditional authority, which would eventually pave the way for the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Black Death was a dark and terrifying chapter in human history, a time of unimaginable suffering and loss. But it was also a catalyst for change, a force that swept away the old and made way for the new. The world that emerged from the ashes of the plague was a different world, a world that was more modern, more dynamic, and more resilient. The Black Death, for all its horror, was a pivotal moment in the making of the modern world. Legacy and conclusion. As our journey through the history of the Black Death comes to a close, we are left with a profound sense of the fragility of human civilization and the enduring power of the human spirit. The plague was a crucible that tested the limits of human resilience, a fire that consumed the old world and forged a new one in its place. Its legacy is a complex and multifaceted one, a story of both darkness and light, of despair and of hope. The Black Death was a pivotal moment in the transition from the medieval to the modern world. It shattered the old feudal order, empowering the common person and paving the way for a more dynamic and more mobile society. It challenged the authority of the church, fostering a new spirit of inquiry and individualism that would eventually lead to the Renaissance and the Reformation. It transformed the economic landscape of Europe, creating new opportunities and new challenges. And it left an indelible mark on the cultural and psychological life of the continent, a legacy of art, literature, and thought that continues to resonate to this day. But the story of the Black Death is also a cautionary tale. It is a reminder of the devastating power of pandemics, of the importance of public health, and of the dangers of fear, ignorance, and prejudice. The persecution of Jews during the plague is a stark reminder of how easily societies can turn on their most vulnerable members in times of crisis. The helplessness of medieval medicine in the face of the plague is a testament to the importance of scientific research and the pursuit of knowledge. As you drift into a deep and peaceful sleep, let the story of the Black Death be a gentle reminder of the long and complex journey of human history. It is a story of struggle and of progress, of darkness and of light. It is a story that is still being written, a story in which we all have a part to play. Let the lessons of the past inform our present and guide our future. And let the quiet contemplation of history be a source of comfort and of peace as you journey into the realm of dreams. Good night. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet wisdom of the ages. The medieval world before the plague. To truly understand the magnitude of the Black Death's impact, we must first paint a picture of the world it was about to transform. Medieval Europe in the early 14th century was a continent on the rise. The population had been growing steadily for centuries, reaching levels that would not be seen again until the 18th century. Cities were expanding, trade was flourishing, and a new sense of optimism pervaded the land. The great cathedrals of Gothic architecture were reaching toward the heavens, symbols of human ambition and divine aspiration. Universities were being founded, scholars were rediscovering the works of ancient philosophers, and a new intellectual awakening was beginning to stir. This was a world of rigid social hierarchies where one's place in society was determined by birth rather than merit. At the top of the pyramid sat the nobility, the lords and ladies who owned vast estates and commanded the loyalty of their vassals. Below them were the knights, the warrior class who served their lords in exchange for land and protection. At the bottom of the social ladder were the peasants, the vast majority of the population who worked the land and lived in conditions of grinding poverty and servitude. The church was the dominant institution of medieval life, its influence extending into every aspect of society. It provided not only spiritual guidance, but also education, healthcare, and social services. The monasteries were centers of learning and culture, preserving the knowledge of the ancient world and creating new works of art and literature. The church's teachings shaped the worldview of medieval people, providing them with a sense of purpose and meaning in a harsh and uncertain world. But this world was also fragile, more fragile than its inhabitants realized. The population growth of the previous centuries had pushed the limits of agricultural productivity. Famines were becoming more frequent, and the margin for survival was growing ever thinner. The climate was beginning to change, with cooler temperatures and more erratic weather patterns disrupting harvests and causing widespread hardship. The stage was set for a catastrophe, and when the Black Death arrived, it found a population that was already weakened and vulnerable. The medieval world was also a world of limited medical knowledge. Physicians relied on the ancient theories of Galen and Hippocrates, which held that illness was caused by an imbalance of the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment consisted of bloodletting, purging, and the administration of herbal remedies, most of which were ineffective and some of which were actually harmful. There was no understanding of the role of bacteria and viruses in causing disease, no concept of contagion, and no effective means of preventing or treating infectious illnesses. When the plague arrived, the medical profession was utterly helpless in the face of its devastating power. The plague's biological warfare. The story of the Black Death's arrival in Europe is not just a tale of natural disaster, but also one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare in human history. The siege of Kaffa in 1347 was a turning point, not only in the spread of the plague, but also in the evolution of military tactics. Khan Janibeg's decision to catapult plague-infested corpses over the city walls was a desperate and horrifying act, born of frustration and desperation. His army was being decimated by the plague, and he saw an opportunity to turn his misfortune into a weapon against his enemies. The psychological impact of this act cannot be overstated. The defenders of Kaffa were not only faced with the prospect of military defeat, but also with the terror of an invisible and deadly enemy that could not be fought with sword or shield. The sight of rotting corpses raining down from the sky must have been a scene from their worst nightmares, a harbinger of the apocalypse that was to come. The Genoese, seasoned traders and warriors though they were utterly unprepared for this new form of warfare. The decision to flee Kaffa by sea was a rational one, given the circumstances, but it also sealed the fate of Europe. The 12 galleys that set sail for Italy carried with them not only refugees, but also the seeds of the pandemic. The rats that infested the ship's holds were the perfect vectors for the plague, and the fleas that lived on these rats were the unwitting agents of death. The journey from Kaffa to Messina took several weeks, during which time the plague had ample opportunity to spread among the passengers and crew. By the time the ships reached Sicily, they had become floating tombs, harbingers of the catastrophe that was about to engulf the continent. The arrival of the death ships at Messina was a moment of profound historical significance. It marked the beginning of the most devastating pandemic in human history, a catastrophe that would reshape the course of European civilization. The Sicilian authorities' decision to order the ships out of the harbor was a futile gesture, a desperate attempt to stem the tide of an unstoppable force. The plague had already taken root, and there was no turning back. Europe was about to enter its darkest hour, a period of death and despair that would test the very limits of human endurance and resilience. Expanded introduction: a world on the brink. Let us delve deeper into the world of the 14th century, a world of vibrant life and ever-present death, a world of faith and fear, a world on the brink of a cataclysm that would forever alter its destiny. Imagine a landscape dotted with castles, their stone walls standing as symbols of power and permanence. Picture the bustling cities with their narrow, winding streets, their magnificent cathedrals reaching for the heavens, and their crowded marketplaces filled with the sights and sounds of a burgeoning commercial revolution. This was a world of stark contrasts, of abject poverty and unimaginable wealth, of profound piety and brutal violence. The rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the liturgical calendar. The vast majority of the population were peasants, their lives tied to the land and the whims of their feudal lords. They toiled from sunrise to sunset, their labor producing the food that sustained the entire society. Their world was small, their horizons limited, their lives a constant struggle against hunger, disease, and the uncertainties of nature. Yet, it was also a world of deep community bonds, of shared traditions, and of a simple, unwavering faith. In the cities, a new class of merchants and artisans was on the rise, their wealth and influence challenging the old feudal order. They built magnificent guild halls, sponsored great works of art, and funded the construction of universities. They were the agents of change, the architects of a new urban culture that was more dynamic, more individualistic, and more worldly than the rural society that surrounded it. But the cities were also breeding grounds for disease. Overcrowded, unsanitary, and infested with rats, they were the perfect environment for the spread of a deadly epidemic. This was a world that was both confident and anxious, a world that was reaching for new heights of achievement while also being haunted by a sense of impending doom. The famines of the early 14th century had left a deep scar on the collective psyche, a reminder of the fragility of human existence. The cooling climate, the political instability, and the growing social tensions all contributed to a sense of unease, a feeling that the world was out of balance. When the Black Death arrived, it was not just a biological event, It was a psychological and spiritual crisis, a moment of reckoning that would force the people of the 14th century to confront their deepest fears and to question their most cherished beliefs. As we continue our journey, we will explore how this world, so full of life and yet so vulnerable, was brought to its knees by an invisible and merciless enemy. Expanded origins. The stirrings of a pandemic let us now journey to the heart of the Eurasian landmass, to the vast and windswept steppes of Central Asia, where the story of the Black Death truly begins. For centuries, this remote and sparsely populated region had been the natural reservoir of Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that would one day unleash a global pandemic. Here, in this isolated ecosystem, the plague existed in a complex and delicate balance with its animal hosts, primarily the marmots, gerbils, and other wild rodents that roamed the grasslands. The plague was not a constant presence, but rather a cyclical one, its outbreaks tied to the fluctuations of the climate and the populations of its hosts. In years of abundance, the rodent populations would boom, and the plague would spread rapidly among them. In years of scarcity, the populations would crash, and the plague would retreat into its hidden reservoirs, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. This was the natural rhythm of the plague, a cycle of boom and bust that had played out for centuries, largely unnoticed by the human world. But the 14th century was a time of unprecedented change. The Mongol Empire, which had once created a vast zone of peace and stability across Eurasia, was beginning to crumble. The Pax Mongolica, which had facilitated trade and travel along the Silk Road, was giving way to a period of increased conflict and political instability. This had a profound impact on the delicate ecosystem of the steppes. The movement of armies, the displacement of populations, and the disruption of traditional land use patterns all contributed to a new and more volatile environment. Climate change also played a crucial role. The 14th century saw the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling that would last for several centuries. In Central Asia, this led to colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and more frequent droughts. These changes put immense pressure on the rodent populations, forcing them to seek new sources of food and water. As they moved, they came into closer contact with domesticated animals, such as camels and horses, and with the human populations that lived along the trade routes. The Silk Road, that ancient artery of commerce, became the primary vector for the plague's westward expansion. The caravans that traversed this vast network of trails carried not only silks, spices, and other luxury goods, but also a deadly cargo of infected fleas and rats. The black rat, Rattus rattus, was a particularly effective carrier of the plague. It was a creature of human settlements, thriving in the crowded and unsanitary conditions of medieval cities and towns. It was also a creature of commerce, stowing away in the holds of ships and the saddlebags of merchants, traveling the world as an unwitting agent of death. The first recorded outbreak of the Black Death occurred in 1338-39, near the Christian trading community of Issyk-Kul in modern-day Kyrgyzstan. Archaeological evidence, in the form of tombstones with inscriptions that speak of a mysterious pestilence, provides a chilling glimpse into the beginnings of the pandemic. From this isolated outpost, the plague began its relentless march westward, a silent and invisible killer that was about to change the course of human history. The world was on the brink of a catastrophe, a perfect storm of biological, environmental, and historical factors that would unleash a pandemic of unimaginable proportions. Expanded arrival, the siege of Kaffa and the death ships, the arrival of the Black Death in Europe was a moment of profound historical significance, a dramatic and terrifying event that would forever be etched in the collective memory of the Western world. The siege of Kaffa in 1347 was the opening act of this tragedy, a horrifying prelude to the catastrophe that was to come. The Mongol army of Khan Janibeg, frustrated by their inability to capture the Genoese trading port, resorted to a tactic of unimaginable cruelty and desperation. They turned their own dead into weapons, catapulting plague-infested corpses over the city walls in a deliberate act of biological warfare. The psychological impact of this act on the defenders of Kaffa must have been immense. They were not only facing a powerful and determined enemy, but also an invisible and terrifying one. The sight of rotting bodies raining down from the sky, the stench of death filling the air, the fear of a disease that they could not see or understand, It was a scene from a nightmare, a vision of hell on earth. The Genoese, seasoned traders and warriors though they were utterly unprepared for this new and horrifying form of warfare. Their decision to flee Kaffa by sea was a rational one, but it was also a fateful one. The 12 galleys that set sail for Italy in the autumn of 1347 were not just carrying refugees, they were carrying the seeds of a pandemic. The holds of the ships were infested with black rats, and the fleas that lived on these rats were carrying the Yersinia pestis bacterium. The journey from Kaffa to Messina was a long and arduous one, and during this time, the plague had ample opportunity to spread among the passengers and crew. By the time the ships reached Sicily, they had become floating coffins, their decks littered with the bodies of the dead and dying. The scene that greeted the people of Messina was one of unimaginable horror. The sailors who were still alive were gravely ill, their bodies covered in the telltale black boils of the plague. They were delirious with fever, their minds clouded by the toxins that were coursing through their veins. The Sicilian authorities, in a desperate attempt to contain the outbreak, ordered the death ships out of the harbor, but it was a futile gesture. The plague had already disembarked, carried ashore by the rats that scurried down the mooring ropes and the fleas that leaped from the bodies of the sick and the dead. From Messina, the plague spread with terrifying speed, a wildfire that consumed everything in its path. It followed the well-established trade routes, moving from port to port, from city to city, from country to country. It reached the Italian mainland, where it devastated the cities of Genoa, Venice, and Florence. It crossed the Alps into France, where it ravaged the cities of Marseille, Paris, and Bordeaux. It crossed the English Channel, where it brought death and despair to the towns and villages of England. No corner of the continent was safe from its relentless advance. The people of medieval Europe were utterly helpless in the face of this onslaught. Their medical knowledge was primitive, their public health measures non-existent, their understanding of the natural world shaped by superstition and fear. They could only watch in terror as their world crumbled around them, as their friends, their families, and their communities were consumed by a pestilence that seemed to have been sent from the very depths of hell. The arrival of the Black Death was not just the beginning of a pandemic, it was the beginning of the end of a world. Expanded symptoms, the agony of the plague, the experience of the Black Death was a descent into a private hell, a journey of unimaginable physical and psychological torment. The symptoms of the plague were as varied as they were horrific, a grotesque and terrifying manifestation of the body's desperate struggle against an invisible and relentless enemy. The accounts of contemporary chroniclers, such as the Florentine poet Giovanni Boccaccio, provide a chilling glimpse into the agony of the plague. The first sign of infection was often a general feeling of malaise, a sense of unease and foreboding. This would soon be followed by a high fever, accompanied by violent chills and uncontrollable shivering. The victim would be racked with terrible aches and pains in their limbs and back, a deep and gnawing pain that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of their bones. They would be overcome by a profound sense of fatigue, a leaden exhaustion that made even the simplest of movements an ordeal. Then came the buboes, the telltale swellings that gave the bubonic plague its name. These would appear in the lymph nodes of the groin, the armpits, and the neck, growing to the size of an apple or an egg. They were hard, painful, and filled with pus, a foul-smelling concoction of dead tissue, bacteria, and white blood cells. The skin around the buboes would often turn a dark, purplish-black color, a result of subcutaneous hemorrhaging. This was the token of the plague, the sign that death was near. As the infection progressed, the victim's body would begin to break down. They would experience severe nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea, which would leave them weak, dehydrated, and emaciated. Their speech would become slurred, their movements uncoordinated, their minds clouded by delirium. They would be tormented by hallucinations, by visions of demons and monsters, by a sense of impending doom. In some cases, the plague would infect the lungs, leading to the even more deadly pneumonic form of the disease. The victim would cough up blood, their breath would become shallow and labored, and they would eventually suffocate in their own fluids. In the most lethal form of the plague, septicemic plague, the bacteria would enter the bloodstream directly, bypassing the lymphatic system altogether. This was a swift and merciless killer, with a mortality rate of nearly 100%. The victim would experience a rapid drop in blood pressure, their organs would begin to fail, and their skin would turn a dark, almost black color as their blood vessels hemorrhaged. Death would often come within a matter of hours, a sudden and shocking end to a terrifying ordeal. The people of the 14th century had no way of understanding the biological processes that were unfolding within their bodies. They could only watch in horror as their loved ones were consumed by a disease that seemed to defy all logic and reason. The stench of death was everywhere. The sound of wailing and lamentation filled the air, and the sight of the dead and dying was a constant reminder of their own mortality. The Black Death was not just a physical illness, it was a psychological and spiritual trauma, a collective nightmare from which there was no escape. Expanded spread. A continent in the grip of fear, the Black Death's relentless march across Europe was a terrifying spectacle, a testament to the power of a microscopic organism to bring a continent to its knees. The plague's progress was not a random or chaotic one, but rather a predictable and systematic one, following the well-established arteries of trade and commerce that crisscrossed the medieval world. The story of its spread is a story of human connection, of the very networks that had fostered prosperity and cultural exchange becoming the conduits of death and despair. From its initial entry point in Sicily in the autumn of 1347, the plague spread with astonishing speed. The port cities of the Mediterranean, the bustling hubs of international trade, were the first to fall. Genoa, Venice, Pisa, Marseille, these were the gateways to Europe, and they became the epicenters of the pandemic. The ships that sailed from these ports, their holds filled with goods and their hulls infested with rats, carried the plague to every corner of the Mediterranean world. By the spring of 1348, the plague had a firm grip on Italy, Spain, and the south of France. The plague's northward march was equally relentless. It followed the great rivers, the Rhone, the Rhine, the Danube, and the overland trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with the heart of Europe. It reached Paris, the largest and most populous city in Europe, in the summer of 1348, where it claimed the lives of an estimated 50,000 people, a quarter of the city's population. It then crossed the English Channel, arriving at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset in August of 1348. From there, it spread rapidly throughout the southwestern counties of England, reaching London by the autumn. The winter of 1348-49 brought a brief respite, as the cold weather slowed the activity of the fleas that transmitted the disease. But with the coming of spring, the plague returned with a vengeance. It swept through the rest of England, Wales, and Ireland, leaving a trail of death and devastation in its wake. It then crossed the North Sea to Scandinavia, where it ravaged the populations of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The story of the plague's arrival in Norway is a particularly poignant one. A ship carrying a cargo of wool from England drifted into the harbor of Bergen, its entire crew dead. The townspeople who unloaded the cargo unknowingly unleashed the plague upon their own community. By the end of 1350, the plague had reached the far corners of Europe, from the remote fishing villages of Greenland to the bustling cities of Russia. The initial wave of the pandemic, the Great Pestilence, had run its course. But the plague was not finished with Europe. It would return in waves, with major outbreaks occurring every few years for the next 3 centuries. The Black Death had become a permanent and terrifying feature of European life, a constant reminder of the fragility of human existence and the awesome power of the natural world. The continent had been transformed, its population decimated, its social and economic fabric torn apart. The world would never be the same again. Expanded consequences, a world turned upside down. The Black Death was not just a demographic catastrophe, it was a social and psychological earthquake that shattered the foundations of medieval society. The sheer scale of the death and suffering, the randomness and inexplicability of the plague, the failure of traditional institutions to provide comfort or protection, all of these factors contributed to a profound crisis of faith and a widespread breakdown of social order. The world, it seemed, had been turned upside down. In the face of a pestilence that seemed to have been sent by God himself, the people of the 14th century responded in a variety of ways. Some turned to fervent piety, flocking to churches, making desperate pleas for mercy, and participating in mass processions and pilgrimages. They saw the plague as a divine punishment for the sins of mankind, a call to repentance and reform. But as the plague continued to rage and as prayers and supplications went unanswered, faith began to waver. The perceived failure of the church to protect its flock from the pestilence led to a decline in its authority and a growing sense of disillusionment and cynicism. This crisis of faith gave rise to a number of extremist religious movements, the most famous of which was the Flagellants. These were groups of penitents who would travel from town to town, whipping themselves with leather scourges studded with iron spikes. They believed that by inflicting this punishment upon themselves, they could atone for the sins of the world and appease the wrath of God. The Flagellants were a dramatic and disturbing spectacle, their processions drawing large crowds of onlookers. They were a symptom of the deep spiritual anxiety that gripped Europe, a desperate and misguided attempt to find meaning and solace in a world that had been plunged into chaos. The search for a scapegoat also led to a horrific wave of violence against Jewish communities. Jews had long been a target of persecution in Christian Europe, and in the atmosphere of fear and paranoia created by the plague, they became an easy target for blame. Rumors spread that Jews were poisoning wells and deliberately spreading the disease. These accusations, though baseless, were widely believed, and they led to a series of brutal pogroms in which thousands of Jews were massacred. The Strasbourg massacre of 1349, in which over 2,000 Jews were burned alive, is just one example of the horrific violence that was unleashed. The persecution of the Jews during the Black Death is a dark and shameful chapter in European history, a stark reminder of the dangers of prejudice and intolerance. The social fabric of medieval Europe was torn apart by the Black Death. The traditional bonds of family and community were severed as people abandoned their sick loved ones for fear of contagion. The sheer number of deaths led to a breakdown in essential services. There were not enough people to bury the dead, and mass graves were dug to accommodate the overwhelming number of corpses. The fields lay fallow, the workshops fell silent, and the cities became ghost towns. The world, it seemed, was coming to an end. But in the midst of this despair, the seeds of a new world were being sown, a world that would be forged in the crucible of the Black Death. Expanded impact, the forging of a new world. The Black Death was a transformative event, a historical turning point that marked the end of the medieval world and the beginning of the modern one. The staggering loss of life, though tragic, had a series of profound and often paradoxical consequences, reshaping the economic, social, and political landscape of Europe in ways that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The most immediate and dramatic impact of the plague was on the labor market. With as much as 60% of the population dead, the chronic labor surplus that had characterized the medieval economy was replaced by a severe labor shortage. This had a revolutionary effect on the lives of the surviving peasants. For the first time in centuries, they found themselves in a position of power. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and greater freedom. The traditional bonds of serfdom, which had tied peasants to the land and subjected them to the will of their feudal lords, began to unravel. The old feudal order, with its rigid social hierarchies and its system of mutual obligation, was crumbling. The ruling classes, of course, did not relinquish their power willingly. They passed laws such as the Statute of Labourers in England, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and to restrict the movement of peasants. But these measures were largely unenforceable, and they often led to popular uprisings, such as the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England and the Jacquerie in France. These revolts, though ultimately unsuccessful, were a clear sign that the old order was dying. A new, more dynamic and more mobile society was being born, a society in which social status was increasingly determined by wealth rather than by birth. The Black Death also had a profound impact on agriculture and land use. With fewer people to work the land, many large estates were abandoned and vast tracts of arable land were converted to pasture. This led to a shift from grain production to sheep farming, which was less labor-intensive and more profitable. The price of grain fell, while the price of wool and other animal products rose. This had a significant impact on the diet and the standard of living of the average person. Meat and dairy products, once a luxury reserved for the rich, became more widely available, and the overall nutritional status of the population improved. The cultural and intellectual life of Europe was also transformed by the plague. The trauma of the Black Death led to a new preoccupation with death and mortality, which was reflected in the art and literature of the period. The Danse Macabre, or Dance of Death, became a popular artistic motif, depicting people from all walks of life being led away by a skeletal figure of death. This new awareness of the fragility of life also contributed to a growing sense of individualism and a questioning of traditional authority, which would eventually pave the way for the Renaissance and the Reformation. The Black Death, for all its horror, was a catalyst for change, a force that swept away the old and made way for the new. The world that emerged from the ashes of the plague was a different world, a world that was more modern, more dynamic, and more resilient. New section: Medieval Medicine and Public Health. To fully appreciate the helplessness of the medieval world in the face of the Black Death, we must delve into the state of medical knowledge and public health in the 14th century. It was a world without antibiotics, without vaccines, without a germ theory of disease. It was a world where medicine was a mixture of folklore, superstition, and ancient Greek philosophy. A world where the line between a physician and a charlatan was often blurred. The dominant medical theory of the time was humorism, which had been inherited from the ancient Greek physicians Hippocrates and Galen. This theory held that the human body was composed of 4 basic substances, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was believed to be the result of a perfect balance of these 4 humors, while illness was caused by an imbalance or dyscrasia. The goal of the physician was to restore this balance through a variety of treatments, most of which were designed to remove an excess of a particular humor. Bloodletting was one of the most common medical procedures of the time. It was believed that by removing a small amount of blood from the patient, the physician could restore the balance of the humors and cure the disease. This was often done by making a small incision in a vein or by applying leeches to the skin. Purging was another common treatment, which involved inducing vomiting or diarrhea through the use of emetics and laxatives. These treatments, though often harmful and sometimes fatal, were based on a coherent, albeit incorrect theory of disease. When the Black Death arrived, the physicians of the 14th century were utterly unprepared. They had never seen a disease like it, a pestilence that was so virulent, so deadly, and so seemingly unstoppable. They tried to apply their traditional remedies, but to no avail. Bloodletting only weakened the patients, making them more susceptible to the infection. Purging only exacerbated the dehydration caused by the vomiting and diarrhea. The herbal remedies and potions that they prescribed were equally ineffective. In the absence of effective treatments, the focus of public health measures was on prevention. But here too, the medieval world was at a disadvantage. There was no understanding of the role of rats and fleas in transmitting the disease, no concept of quarantine, no appreciation for the importance of sanitation and hygiene. The cities of the 14th century were crowded, filthy, and infested with rats. The streets were filled with garbage and human waste, the water supply was often contaminated, and people lived in close quarters with their animals. It was the perfect environment for the spread of a deadly epidemic. Some cities did attempt to implement public health measures, such as closing their gates to outsiders, banning public gatherings, and establishing pest houses for the sick. But these measures were often too little, too late. The plague was a silent and invisible killer, and by the time a city realized it was under attack, it was often too late to stop the spread of the infection. The Black Death was a stark and brutal lesson in the importance of public health, a lesson that would not be fully learned for centuries to come. New section: The psychological impact of the plague. The Black Death was not just a biological and social crisis, it was also a profound psychological trauma, a collective nightmare that left an indelible scar on the psyche of the medieval world. The sheer scale of the death and suffering, the randomness and inexplicability of the plague, the breakdown of social order, all of these factors contributed to a deep and pervasive sense of fear, anxiety, and despair. Imagine living in a world where death was a constant and unpredictable presence. Imagine watching your friends, your family, and your neighbors succumb to a gruesome and agonizing disease. Imagine the fear of knowing that you could be next, that at any moment you could feel the first telltale signs of the plague. This was the reality for the people of the 14th century, a reality that would have been almost impossible to bear. One of the most common psychological reactions to the plague was a sense of fatalism, a belief that the world was coming to an end. The Black Death was seen by many as a sign of the apocalypse, a fulfillment of the prophecies of the Book of Revelation. This belief was reinforced by the social and religious upheavals of the time, by the failure of the church to provide comfort or protection, by the breakdown of traditional authority. In the face of such overwhelming and incomprehensible suffering, it was easy to believe that the end of the world was at hand. Another common reaction was a desperate and hedonistic embrace of life. If death was inevitable, then why not live for the moment? This sentiment was captured by Boccaccio in his Decameron, which tells the story of a group of young people who flee the plague-ridden city of Florence and retreat to a country villa where they spend their days telling stories, singing songs, and enjoying the pleasures of life. This carpe diem attitude was a way of coping with the ever-present threat of death, a way of finding joy and meaning in a world that had been plunged into darkness. But the plague also brought out the worst in human nature. The fear of contagion led to a breakdown of the most basic human bonds. Parents abandoned their sick children, husbands left their wives, and the sick were left to die alone without comfort or care. The search for a scapegoat led to horrific acts of violence against Jewish communities. The breakdown of social order led to an increase in crime and lawlessness. The Black Death revealed the dark side of human nature, the capacity for cruelty, selfishness, and intolerance that lies dormant in all of us. The psychological trauma of the plague would linger for generations. It would be reflected in the art and literature of the period, in the preoccupation with death and mortality, in the sense of anxiety and unease that pervades so much of late medieval culture. The Black Death was a collective trauma, a shared experience of suffering and loss that would forever alter the way that the people of Europe saw themselves and their world. It was a stark and brutal reminder of the fragility of human life and the awesome power of the natural world, a lesson that would not be soon forgotten.